Now let's switch our attention to the workshop. And before starting the original workshop and hearing introduction from our awesome workshop giver, I want to give space to Pavitra. This is our special guest today. So Pavitra, can you share a screen? Oh, sorry, not share a screen, show yourself, unmute yourself, of course. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I am Pavitra, and I am joining you from India. I'm a core team member of Bokeh, what this talk is about today, and I'm just here for some Q&A support and just to answer your questions in the comments. And if you want to have some discussions or if you want to further discuss and maybe join us with development or anything, you can reach out to me. So excited for the workshop, and I hope to hear from all of you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pavitra. So brief guidelines before we start the whole part. If you have any questions, you can ask them in the chat. So if it's something that is easy to answer, we'll just type the answer back. And if it can wait, then we have a special dedicated Q&A session, and another special guest will join this Q&A session. It's actually Brian, a co-creator of the Bokeh library. So this is about Q&A question, ask it in a chat. Then we give you answer immediately if it's simple. If it's not, we point you to the right direction, or keep your question until the end of the day when will Brian join us, and we have a sort of like a panel discussion with Pavitra, Bhoomika, and Brian. Okay, so now time for Bhoomika to shine. Bhoomika, please share your screen. And also on
my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, so I'm Bhoomika and I will be teaching Bokeh today. And I thought it would be nice. So I'm a master's student at TU Delft right now. I'm studying data science, and I've always been very fascinated by interactive data visualizations, and I think Bokeh has done a really good job with making it super simple and super easy. So I just want to help people learn how to work with Bokeh. And I thought it would be nice to start with a geeky programmer joke. And that also covers data visualization. So there are 1-0 type of people in life, those who understand binary and those who don't. So this is a super simple data visualization of data. And we will see a lot more of these kind of visualizations throughout this workshop. So to get started, I hope you have GitHub, you have cloned the Git repo. And 2 things to keep in mind. I'm using Jupyter Lab here, simply because I really like the interface and the shortcuts. You can also use Jupyter Notebooks. And the other thing is that I'm using Anaconda, or whichever, whether you're using Anaconda, Miniconda, or virtual environment, make sure to navigate to the directory where your code is stored and switch to the environment and then start Jupyter Lab. So I hope you have this setup ready. So I'll be starting with the workshop. There are exercises in between, 5 of them. So I will be giving pit stops for exercises. And you can also ask any questions during the exercises. If they're short, we'll answer them then, or I'll push them to the Q&A session. But either way, no question is stupid. Just ask any question that comes to your mind. So yeah, in this workshop, we'll be covering setup tests. What is Bokeh and why I wanted to do Bokeh. Then we look at a demo. Then we go into the basic steps. And then we look at glyphs, and so far we only look at using data or sample data. And then we look at using real data in our graphs. Finally, we come to the interactions, which is the selling point of Bokeh, I think. And then we look at exporting visualizations. So besides this, Bokeh also has a lot of functionality in terms of apps, servers, frameworks. Due to time constraints, and also because I do not want to overload you all with information in 1.5 hours, I won't be covering those. But there are links in the end if you're interested into going into those details. So to start off, like I said, we will look at the setup. So we are mainly using IPython, which is basically something that integrates with your Jupyter notebooks. We're using Pandas, which is a data visualization library, and Bokeh, which is our main library. And shortcuts in Jupyter Lab, it's Control Enter to execute your cell. So we start with exercise 0, and if this command gives you this output, that means your setup is complete and you're ready to go. So first things first, I would advise that you check this out. Then moving on to the real content of the workshop. What is Bokeh? So like this picture shows, Bokeh is basically just a picture that is out of focus so that it can focus on other things as well. So that is one way of looking at Bokeh. And when we extrapolate this to data visualization, it's also an interactive Python library that helps you with data visualization and can do beautiful things. And like we'll see in this workshop, it makes it super simple with just 4 lines or 3 lines of code. You can create a beautiful visualization. So that's the logo of Bokeh. Quite colorful and quite simple, as the name suggests. So the main key points of Bokeh are that 1, it's interactive. 2, it uses HTML and JavaScript, so it integrates with your browser and doesn't need any extra software. It's very portable. And because it uses HTML and JavaScript, it can be integrated with anything in the web, with web apps, it can be used to create dashboards and so much more. And one of the reasons I picked it for a 1.5-hour workshop is because you can use it very quickly to make interactive visualizations, and you'll be surprised at how much you'll be able to learn at the end of 1.5 hours. So these are just some standard imports. I will explain them during the course of the workshop. The important thing to note is that when I run this cell, you should see this being displayed. If this is displayed, then all your setup is good and Bokeh has been loaded into your Jupyter notebook. So going to the demo, for some reason, the Bokeh demo website is down at the moment. So probably, yeah, that's something I also checked the website and I tried to hit it and it seems to be down. But the idea was to show you a simple demo of a slightly complex Bokeh interaction. So yeah, since that's not working, we'll just directly dive into it. But basically, Bokeh allows you to have graphs with sliders, with selections, with hover tools. You can have graphs that are linked to each other and so much more interactions. So, and yes, this was also supposed to be a slightly complex demo that was supposed to show you the full functionality, the length and the breadth of it, but yeah, it doesn't seem to be working at the moment. So apologies for that. But yeah, anyway, as overwhelming as it may seem, it's actually quite simple to create this, and we will create quite complex ones by the end of it. So when we look at Bokeh visualizations, there are 3 main steps that you need to keep in mind. The first one is that you have to always create a figure. So creating a figure is like having a blank page. Unless you have a blank page, you cannot draw. You cannot draw in thin air. So it gives you some sort of a framework to create everything. And a glyph is any sort of visualization. It can be a shape, it can be lines, bars, all of that. And once you have added all of this, obviously you need to visualize it. So show or save will allow Bokeh to bring the visualization or display the visualization. So you create a figure, call a glyph, and then show it. 3 very simple steps. And we will do really complex things with just these 3 steps. So figure, glyph, show. That's all Bokeh is. 3 really simple steps. So we look at one step at a time. First thing that we're going to look at is how to create a blank figure. And so here, Bokeh allows you 2 main output options. The first is output notebook. That is, it allows you to output an inline visualization in your Jupyter notebook. The second is output file, and you also pass a parameter with the file name. So this will write the output to your file. Basically, it's exporting your visualization to HTML. So in this, most of the workshop, we will look at output notebook. And towards the end, when I look at exporting, we will also look at output file. So yeah, and you can read more about, in almost every step, I've added references that you can look up to find out more about these things. So this is 3 lines of code that just gives you a simple blank figure, like you can see here. And also Bokeh tells you that there's no renderers, there's nothing added. What are you doing, basically? So from Bokeh plotting, we import the figure, and we're just setting the width and the height of the figure. And then show figure just shows the figure, displays the figure, basically. So simple enough to create a blank page, but there's no real use to a blank page. So let's start adding simple glyphs. So glyphs are basically the building blocks of any visualization. If any of you have used ggplot or R, then you know that glyphs are basically the equivalent of joms. So the idea is that you make your visualization layer by layer. So you create a blank figure, then you add your glyphs, and then you can keep adding layers on top of it. So there's a lot of information about glyphs. We look at really simple ones here. The first glyph that we look at is a scatter plot. A scatter plot is basically just drawing points on a graph. That's all it is. So there are a lot of marker glyphs that you can use, ranging from circle to square to triangle to asterisk to check marks, and there are a lot of them that you can explore here. And we start with a simple circle. So first we create a figure plot, that is, create a blank plot. Then we just use the function plot.circle, and these are the x dimensions, these are the y dimensions, and we specify the size of the circle. The line color is then we specify the color of the circle itself, and alpha is the opacity. And then we show the plot. So with 3 lines, you have a simple plot ready. How awesome is that? So with this, I'm going to take a pit stop and allow you to write your first exercise. Here, the exercises that you use in the first graph that we created, we use circles, and the exercise is to use squares instead of circles. And as you saw, I use parameters here of size and color and fill color. So also explore these parameters. So I'm going to give a 5-minute break for questions and also to try out the exercise. So if I change the size, you can already see them getting bigger. And similarly, if I make this blue, ta-da! So that's exploring the parameters. And go ahead and try to write your own code with creating a square. Okay, the demo website is still down. If you have any questions, just raise your hand or put it in the chat. Now is a good time. Do we have any questions in the chat? Okay, so we have a break until 6:55. You can try out, and then I will also show you the solution for this. And just to give you a hint, just like we have a plot.circle method, there's a plot.square method. It's as simple as that. So give it a shot and see how you can create a visualization with just 4 to 5. Size and fill color are two of the many parameters that you can configure. So there's a list of all the styling properties that you can configure here as well. So I've linked that. Go ahead, explore it, see all the things that you can do. And another pretty cool thing that I think is nice is I can also pass the fill color as an array. So if I give, since there are 5 points, I have to obviously give 5 values. And now it gets mapped 1-to-1, and you can see how nicely, how colorful your graph is. So most of the parameters can also take lists, and you have to make sure that the size of the list is corresponding to the size of the size of the list of parameters is corresponding to the size of the list of number of points or number of values that you provide. So this is about experimenting with the parameters, and hopefully you would have also figured out how to do the squares. So I'm going to carry on and show you that as well. There, just by changing one word, we have changed the visualization. So hopefully you were able to make a simple visualization. And can the size also be proportional to something? Proportional to something value on, yes, the size can be proportional. So in that case, there is a radius option. I think, yeah, I don't remember what exactly. I think its radius is 10, no, 0.5. You don't know, but the radius can only be applied in the case of a circle. So I think, yeah, so now this is proportional to the grid. So because I gave 0.5, it's going to take half the breadth of the grid. So if I make it 0.1, then it's proportional to the grid again. So yes, it can be varied according to whatever, according to the grid itself. Terminal Jupyter Lab.
Bhoomika, I have a quick question. Can you show what happens if the length of the list with fill color doesn't correspond to the length of the list of x and y coordinates?
Okay, what do you think will happen? we only get 4 points short because we have 1 point without any color, and then the last point is missing in this case.
Great, thanks a lot.
Yeah, and it also gives you an error saying that the length of fill color is 4 and you have 5 in X and Y. So yeah, Bokeh makes life easy for you by giving you the errors in the most understandable way. Okay, so now moving on to the next clip. The next clip that we're going to look at, obviously one of the most commonly used visualization is scatter plot. In my opinion, the second most commonly used is line plot, which is basically just a line running through all your points. And because Bokeh wants to make your life really easy, the function for it is just called plot.line. So we have plot.line, and we pass a list with the X values, a list with the Y values, and the width of the line. That's all. And I have also provided a title for most of my figures because, well, it's always good to be neat. So with this, you have a line plot ready. As simple as just changing the name of the glyph, and you have completely different visualization. So the third glyph that we look at, I think these two are quite simple. Let's move to something a little more complex. So bar charts are basically just creating areas that correspond to numbers or some sort of frequency. So I just go with bands and the number of songs heard. So I create a list of categorical values which correspond to each of the X values, and then create an empty figure. And for bar charts, we have V bar, that is vertical bar, and I say X is whatever, and instead of Y, we have a top, which is basically just the top of the bar. And then we give the width. Here I'm giving 0.9 so that you can see some gaps, and then it's differentiable. And these are just other things to make your graph look better. So I'm making the X grids invisible by making the color none. And I'm starting the Y at 0. That's just basic things to make your graph look pretty and nice. So when I run this, you can see a pretty nice and beautiful bar chart that's already ready for you. So all you have to do is use VBar and provide two arrays. First one in X, the second one in top, and your bar chart's ready. So even slightly more complex visualization like a bar chart is made super simple for you with Bokeh. And any guesses at what your horizontal charts would be called? Horizontal bars would be called? Yes, going by obviousness of Bokeh, it's called H bar. That is horizontal bars. So far we looked at adding one glyph at a time. And how about we try adding multiple glyphs to the same figure? And a lot of times a data visualization that makes things a lot more clearer, and for complex visualization, you need lines, circles, all of that together. So Bokeh allows you to obviously do that as well. And the only thing you have to remember is that they're drawn in the order in which they're called. So when I call line first and circle later, my line is shown before the circle. So maybe I can also make that. So if you can see because I'm calling line first and then circle, the circles are shown on top. But if I reverse this order, the line is shown on top. So whatever order you execute the glyphs in, that's the order in which it's called. And yeah, that's about it. It's that simple. All you have to do is just stack your glyphs one on top of each other, and layers are added one on top of the other. Simple? Okay, now it's time for the second exercise. How about you try to create a plot with triangle markers and a line chart both? So now it's time to get some hands-on for yourself. So yeah, I'm going to give you time 5 minutes. So 7:02 now. You have time until 7:05, and also pit stop for questions. If you have any questions, just drop them in the chat and I'll try to answer them. And also for the colors, you can give the colors here. I'm giving specific values which are defined by Bokeh. So orange, red, yellow, blue. You can also give hexagonal values. You can give RGBA values. You can give YMCA values. You can, I think, yeah, those are the 4 formats supported for your colors. So if you've had any success with the second exercise, maybe just give a thumbs up or raise your hand. That will give me an idea of how many people are still with me.
In the meantime, there is a question from Jeanette. Can you talk about size parameters? Circle size equal to 15 is smaller than bar width 0.9.
So the bar width here is the this entire thing. So the bar width goes from 0 to 1. So it's only, I can say it's sort of like a percentage. And these size parameters vary from each glyph. So if you look at line, we have a line width is equal to 2. So if I make this, I think 0.2, it's super thin. And if I make this 10, then super thick. So it varies per glyph, and yeah, that's the basic idea. So, and even when you look at the circle itself, you have a size parameter and a radius parameter. So again, you have to look at the specific glyph and look at the size parameter accordingly. So in the case of bar charts, it's just a ratio of, so if I make this 1, there's absolutely no space between them. And if I make this 0.5, it becomes, there's an equal spacing between the width and the empty space. So yeah, you just need to look at your specific glyph for the size. See more questions.
I think it's all that already answered or related to previous answers. Yeah, so it's only this was unanswered. So Jeanette, we do hope that it answered your question. If not, please feel free to add any extra information.
Okay, so for this one, I'll just show you the solution. I'm going to just use the same thing, and yeah, with that, so all I had to do is change the name of the glyph. And because I'm using triangle glyphs and Bokeh likes to keep things super simple, the function is just called plot.triangle. And once I change the name of the function, I have the entire visualization changed. So yeah, that's the solution for the second exercise. Now we come to, so far I have created lists for all of our data, but in most data visualization use cases, we don't work with lists because we usually have data coming from a different source and all you have to do is visualize it. So here we look, in this section, we look at how to import data into our graphs. So Bokeh uses an object called a column data source, which is basically just, it's a middle ground for all kinds of data to be represented. So the idea behind I think at least my understanding is that column data source is basically a middle ground where if you use anything like a NumPy array or a pandas series or a pandas data frame or any kind of data type, eventually everything is converted into a column data source. And the advantage of using a column data source is that all of the features of Bokeh, ranging from tooltips to transforms to custom interactions, work on a column data source. So because we have a middle ground, all of our interactions are supported. And effectively, it's just a mapping between the column names and the list of data. That's all a column data source is. So in this use case, we'll be looking at sample data. We'll take some sample data and try to visualize it. And Bokeh also gives you some sample data to work with and explore. So to get your sample data, just run these two commands. It will download the sample data and store it in a directory for you. And in my case, it's already downloaded, so it's skipping everything. So one of the sample data set is an iris sample data set, which is basically a type of flower, and it covers a lot of data about flowers, ranging from the sepal to the petal width, all of that. So in this case, we are going to plot a scatter plot using this data set. And obviously the rest of the plotting remains the same, where we create a figure, a circle, and then show a plot. What changes here is the way we import our data. So we firstly import a column data source, then we import the data set, that is bokeh.sampledata.iris, and we're importing it as df, that's just the name. Because it's a pandas data frame, we're just calling it df. And here we are passing it to column data source, so that this source that we get is an instance of the pandas data frame wrapped in a column data source object. So essentially it's being converted, a pandas data frame is being converted into a column data source. And then we can use this source wherever, in any visualization, any interaction, anything at all. So all you have to do is import your pandas data frame, put it into a source column data source object, and that's all you need to do to use an external data source. And the other thing you need to keep in mind is whichever glyph you want to plot, there will always be a source parameter in every glyph. So you can just say source is equal to, and you give the name of the source. Here I've called my source as source, just for simplicity's sake. So I just say my source parameter is equal to source. And with that, we have successfully used an external data source. So this is just a simple iris data set, and in here we can also show you the functionalities of Bokeh. So Bokeh also comes with an inbuilt toolbar that allows you simple interactions. So this is a box zoom. This is just to zoom in. You can save your data. You can So here I think very few of those are enabled, but there is always a toolbar that is inbuilt. So I think demo is still down. So yeah, demo is not yet loading, but this is very simple demo for you of what Bokeh can do. So yeah, now it's time for our next exercise for trying to import slightly more complex data and make a line graph with it. So we use the glucose data set, again from the sample data set, and this is a time series data set. So we're going to plot time against the glucose values. And before plotting any data set, it's always nice to import it and also to take a look at what the data set contains. So because this is a pandas data frame, we can say data.head, and this will give us the top 5 values. So here we can see that there is a glucose value, a glucose series, and I don't know what this ISIG series is, but we know that we have 3 series: date time, ISIG, and glucose. So, and also there are a lot of values in this. So what we will do is take a subset of this data and plot the date time axis against the glucose axis. So one other really nice feature that Bokeh gives you is that if you want to plot date time axis, you just need to specify the x-axis type as date time when you're calling the figure, and then most of the other conversion of date time is taken care of for you. So we first start with taking a subset of this data from, we just take 8 of the data, take a week's worth of data, and then in the figure we specify that the x-axis is date time, and that's about it. And these are just some other parameters. Again, the x grid, I'm just making it transparent. I'm making the grid line alpha as 0.5, and I add a label to my x-axis and a label to my y-axis. And then week is the subset of the data that we have. In that, I am looking at the index and the glucose data. So once I have that specified, it plots all of our data for us. So it's this simple to plot data with to plot time series data using Bokeh. So now it's time for our third exercise, and I'm going to give you a 10-minute break. I think it's also a good time to take a bio break. So if you want to grab some tea, use the washroom, and also ask questions, now is a good time to do that. So this exercise is, we look at the stocks data for Google, and we try to create a plot, a line plot for it. Again, this is the time series data, and what you have to take into account here is that the date time values are date strings, and you need to convert them into date time values. So just to give you a hint, this will convert your date time values to real date times, and all you have to do after that is plot it as time series data. So go ahead and try out this exercise, and yeah, we'll resume at 7:25. And yeah, go. Any questions? Drop them in the chat.
Yeah, I see we have already some of them. And actually the first question is, how can I have different colors per category? For instance, the iris data set using species.
So Iris, for each category of data, there is a parameter where you can say that where you can specify that in this subset of data I want this color, and in this other subset of data I want this other color. So that is one way to do it. And the other way is how I passed a list of colors. You could also try that. So yeah, those are two ways to do it. I don't remember the name of the exact parameter to specify for each subset, but there is definitely a parameter for that. Does that answer your question sufficient?
And also another question, how can I get the sample data glucose data set? Oh, yeah, you're already showing it's like slide 52. Yeah.
So you just need to say bokeh.sampledata.glucose import data. And before doing that, you need to download all the sample data. So these two commands will download all the sample data.
Okay, so first download and then
import.
And then import. And there are different samples of the data sets available, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So I think there's a link for all the sample data. You can check out what sample data is available and what you can do with it. Change the format of the timestamps on the glucose plot. There is I think there is a format parameter for that. Yeah, so I think if you give D type, then you can change the format. So here I'm giving np dot whatever, but if you configure the D type parameter, you can change the format of the date type.
Okay. Oh, you're answering the question how I can change the format of timestamps on the glucose plot, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions?
No, so far. I think everybody is really busy with creating their own visualization.
Okay, I'm going to also take a quick break and grab some coffee. So I will see you back in 5 minutes.
Sure, of course. That was against time volume or which one?
Hi, I'm back. So the questions regarding which value to plot, you can either do the closing time or the adjusted closing time or high, low, any value at all. The idea is just to make sure that you know how to convert from NumPy data types to Bokeh data types and plot it against a datetime axis. So if you have that sorted out, then it doesn't matter which of the axis or which of the values you're plotting on the axis. So and yes, like Pavitra mentioned, please feel free to tweet your visualizations to PyLadies Amsterdam and also to Bokeh. We'd love to see the beautiful visualizations that you create throughout this workshop.
Definitely. I will add the tag. So if you want to tweet a visualization, I'm sending to the chat our.
So getting back to the visualization. So first things first, we're going to examine the data. So when we print all the keys, you can see that there's a date value, there's opening value, a high value, a low value, closing volume, and I think that's adjusted closing time. So this gives us an idea that we need date and any other of the columns to plot against. So then the next step we need to do is convert it from a string date to a real datetime value. So then we do, so we use this command to convert the date value into any other value. Then first things first, create a blank figure, specify the x-axis as the datetime, and other parameters, just title, graph parameters. And then we just say plot.line. Dates is the list in which I'm storing the output of the converted data. So that on the x-axis, and here I'm plotting the closing time. So since we're importing the data set as GOG, then we say we specify that we want the close column of it and show a plot. So it's as simple as this. So moving on from here, we will look at the crux of Bokeh, that is the interactions. And this is also my favorite part of Bokeh. So let's jump in on the interactions. So the first interaction that we look at is the hover tool. That's basically let's say here when I hover, I see a link. So we want to do that for a graph. And this can be done for basically any kind of glyph. And all you have to do is specify a list of tuples, that is the name, and which is a pair of the, which is basically the, it has two parameters or two elements. The first set of elements is the label that you want to give it on the hover tool. And the second one is the field that you want to use. So if you look here, this is the labels or the names of the indexes that we want to give in the hover tool. And the second is a list of the actual values in the source. So when you say $x and $y, this is referring to the graph parameters. So whenever you specify dollar, it refers to the graph parameters. And whenever you're given @, then you're referring to the value in the source. So if you look at our column data source here, we have 3 dictionaries, an X, a Y, and a description. So when I say @description, I'm referring to this list. So far, the only thing you need to remember or the only thing that's different about a hover tool is that we have this object called hover tool. And the most important part of the hover tool is this array called, or this list called tooltips, which has two main values. The first is the name that you want to give to whatever the hover shows or the label. Second is the actual values that you want to display. These values can either be graph values, which are denoted with a $sign, or they can be values from the source itself, which are denoted with an @sign. So we have our data source, we have our hover tooltip ready. How do we put them together now? So all you have to do is, in your figure, you specify under tools that you want a hover tool. That's the first step that adds this hover tooltip. Since I've called it hover, I just say under the tools I want this hover. And as with any column data source, we give source is equal to source. And now you see the magic happen. So when I hover over this, you can see the index being specified. So you see the first label that I gave is an index, and the second one is X and Y, and the third one is description. So as I hover over each of these, it just gives me a description. So let's try something different. I think this will have to be line. No, 20 is too much. So now we have a line, and as you hover over each of the points in the line, you can also see the hover tooltip. So the basic idea is that you can add a hover tooltip to any glyph, provided you specify that in the figure and add the corresponding data source. That's simple. Two things to remember: hover tool object, tooltips with a label and a value. As simple as that. So we have our first interaction ready. Next thing, we want to look at try to add some widgets, which basically allow us to take an input. And that's about it. So this is a simple slider widget that allows me to select any value. Now we have the widget, we have the graph. How can we integrate this? That's the question. So Bokeh provides you with a functionality to include custom JS, that is custom JavaScript, into any of your visualizations. So all you have to do is include small parts of JavaScript code, and then the actions triggered by this can be used on the JS on change method on any of the Bokeh objects, and this will cause a change in the graph. So when you select a value in the widget, for example in the slider, that value is returned to the JS on change method, and then that can be reflected onto your graph basically. So actually, let me just show you the output of this and then go to explain it. So this is basically just a power graph. So if I make it 2, I'm getting a graph with x square y. And if I make this 3, I get x cube y. So that's the basic idea of how to integrate a widget and to take the value of that widget and reflect it on the graph. So that's one of the beauties of the interaction that you can do. So how the main difference that this can make for you is, let me give you an example. Let's say you want to show the change in the energy usage based on, let's say you want to show that if I use my air conditioner for 2 hours, how much is the energy consumption? So either I can tell the user that if you use it for so many hours, it's going to give you this. If you use it for 2 hours, it's going to give you so much energy consumption. That's one way to do it. But then those numbers never stay in anyone's head. The other way to do it is program this into a nice interactive visualization. And then I let the user say that, okay, when I could take the slider as a number of hours and then plot it accordingly. So let's say the user says selects 1 hour of energy usage per day, then I can show him the difference of what is the usage for an hour versus the usage for 5 hours. And then those visualizations stick much better in the user's memory as compared to just numbers. Because I think as humans, we are programmed to remember pictures and not numbers. So that's the power of bringing interactions into your visualizations. So now coming to how we made this visualization and integrated it with the widget. So we did 2 really simple things. Remember the slider widget that we created here, which is basically just a slider object where we specify the starting value, the ending value. Value is just the default value that is shown when the widget is loaded. So I've specified that as 1. If I make this 2, then 2 is the default value selected. I'm specifying the step as 0.1, so one movement increases it by 0.1. And title is just whatever you want to name it. And then I say show slider. That's how I created my slider widget. So here I do the same thing where I just create a list of values for my X. So in my data source, I have my X values, and I create a column data source which is a dictionary of X is equal to X and Y is initially X, because the initial value of my widget is 1. So X to the power 1 is always just X. Then comes the interaction magic, where, so initially I just plot a simple line with the source given, and then I create a slider, and the custom JS is where the actual beauty of the interaction happens. So here I just have the data as the source.data, which is this. And I have a variable f with the value of the slider. That is effectively each time the slider is moved or changed, the value is returned in this variable slider.value. So my variable f has the value of the slider. X is just the x-axis, y is the y-axis, and then this is just a simple for loop where I'm computing x to the power of y. And here, if you look at this, I'm computing x of I to the power of f, and f is the value returned by my slider. So I'm taking that the value of my slider, computing the y value based on that, and then I say source.change.emit. Because we are overwriting the same source, this is required in JavaScript. And then I say slider.js on change for the parameter value, that is the value of the slider. I want to run this function update curve, which is the function that makes this entire change. So if I have to give a starting point to this, I would say this is where it all starts. Slider.js on change. I specify which value of my slider should the change be on and what should the change be. So, and then I write the entire code for what is the change. Simple enough. So this is just a really simple slider widget integrated into a graph. Now it's time for some more hands-on. Let's try doing the same for a select widget. So I'm going to give you some help here. Let's try to look at what is the select widget. So there's more information about all the widgets here. So let's look at the select widget. So there is a title, there's a value, and there are these options. So this is effectively what a select widget is. So I have foo, bar, backs, whatever, you can give any values here. And then you need to give a select.js on change with maybe the same code. And here, all I want you to do is implement this same code, but with a select widget. So you have 5 minutes, it's 7:40 now. Take 5 minutes, look at the documentation and try your hand at integrating interactions into your graph. Good luck. And also time for questions. So the chat is open to you.
I think the first question will be how to learn to write something in JavaScript, right?
So I think most of the syntax is more or less the same. As with Python, you just have to, you define a variable with var. Loops are the same as with, I think, the same syntax more or less as with Python. And the main things you need to remember is you need to specify the data source, and the value that you're getting from your widget, X and Y, what updates you want to make, and also make sure to give this line which will reflect your changes in your data source. So if you have this sorted out, I think you're mostly good to go. JavaScript is very, very simple syntax like Python. So don't let that bother you. Any questions about the interactions so far?
I think everybody just reading documentation on select.
Yeah. So my advice to you would be that just understand the concepts, and then after that it's just about looking at the documentation and figuring out what parameters to use. And I have tried my best to integrate the documentation as far as possible into this workbook so that you don't have to go around looking too much. So good luck. You have 2 more minutes to try this out, and then I'll give you the solution.
There is a question from Michael.
The select widget is this widget, the selection widget. So it just gives you a drop down with a set of values that you can pick from. So we looked at the slider widget, which is this widget. Basically, it allows you to slide through a set of values. So I want you to try out a different widget. That is this one, the select one. Also, feel free to explore all the other widgets. There's a whole range of them.
Oh, there is a good question. If you can get back for a second, yeah, for the JavaScript.
So for I++ is basically, this is the same as I is equal to I plus 1. So I++ is just a short form of I is equal to I plus 1. So basically, it's a way of incrementing the variable by 1. So this works in exactly the same way as the previous thing, but as programmers, we are inherently lazy, and incrementing by 1 is a very common use case used in for loops and a lot of programming. So we just created a shortcut for it. And also the I++ works with Python, and I think with most programming languages it's supported. So yeah, that's basically all it is. Anyway, I hope you have been able to explore the select widget. Just look at the syntax of it in the documentation, and integrating it is very simple. I assure you that. So just like we integrated the select widget, the slider widget, it's very simple to integrate the select widget as well. So take a look at the documentation, and I'm sure that you will be able to do it. So I'll come back to the solutions of this later on in the interest of time. So moving on to the next section, that is data selection. So one other thing that is one other feature that is very nice to have is allowing the user to select a particular subset of data. So we have a lot of select tools that can be used to select a part of the data so that a specific part of the data can be highlighted. So one of these tools is the lasso select tool. So before I think it's easiest to explain the tool with a demo. So when I select this part of the data, I'm only showing this part of the data on the second graph. So that is the interactivity that we're trying to add. And this tool that allows me to select all of this data as a random lasso is the lasso select tool. I think it's named after the cowboy lasso, which is like a whip that allows you to select or grab things. So that's the idea. So here, if you look at this, there are two main things that are happening here. The first is this lasso select tool. And then the second is that we have two graphs and we're connecting the data between them. So let's break it down and look at each part one at a time. So firstly, we have to create data sources. So random is a function that generates a random value, just like the name suggests. So it's programmed randomness in the sense that it will just give you a value, just some random value. That's all it does. So I'm taking range of 500. So I'm creating 500 random values for my X and 500 random values for Y. And that becomes my data source. So far, so good, I hope. Then the second thing that we need to do is bring in the lasso select tool. So in the tools parameter inside my figure, I specify lasso underscore select. This enables the lasso select tool in the toolbar. I think there is also a document about how to select these tools. Yeah, the configuring plot tools that has all the options for the different tools that you can bring in. So we have a lasso select tool, and with this we are enabling the lasso select tool. And then I'm creating, so I have two data sources, S1 and S2. So S1 is the data source for the first graph, S2 is for the second. Similarly, I have P1 and P2 for the first one and the second one. So initially, the second graph is just empty. So all I'm doing here is I'm creating an empty column data source, and I'm creating a figure with nothing at all. And for the second one, I'm giving source as S2. So because my data source is empty, it's not going to display anything. So this is effectively just creating an empty figure at the beginning. So if I reload this, this is what we need to start with. I have 500 random points in my first data source and an empty graph in my second data source. Then the next thing that I do is, so I'm trying to take, okay, so I have indices, which is, so when I say in the first one, when I'm selecting a number of points, I want to trigger the JSOnChange method on the indices being selected. So, and then I have a custom callback where I'm giving a dictionary with S1 and S2 as my data sources, and I specify all the code. So D1 is my first data source, D2 is my second data source. And for my second data source, I start with an empty array, and then I just push the indices of I, that is all the indexes of the selected ones, are just being pushed to X and Y. So the second data source X is effectively the indices that are selected, X values. And for the indices that are selected, I put the Y values in the second data source Y. And if you remember from the previous interaction, we need to emit the change. Then Bokeh also allows you to plot two graphs one beside the other. So row is just a way to do that, where I say that P1 and P2 are to be plotted as a row of plots. And then when I select anything here, these indices are selected and pushed onto my second graph. So that's how I create a lasso select and connect two graphs simply by connecting their data sources. The next and the last interaction that we're looking at is linked brushing. So I'm not sure how to explain it exactly, so I'm just going to show you what it is. This is effectively what it is. So I have two graphs with the same data source, and when I select a number of points on the first graph, the same points are highlighted on the second graph. That's linked brushing. So a brush is something that lets you select a certain number of points, and I'm linking the same between two graphs. So that's what linked brushing does for you. And in this case, I'm using, so I take a number of tools. So for this, I'm allowing a box plot as a selection, and also there's a lasso select enabled. So in the tools, I specify tools as all the tools that I want to enable in my toolbar. And so when I create a figure, I give an array of tools and the width and the height, obviously. And in my data source, I have X as just a set of a list between -20 and 21. And Y is, so Y0 and Y1 is effectively just the absolute values of X and X square for the X values. So I'm just generating two plots for it, one with absolute values, the second with squares. And in my column data source, I have X, Y0, and Y1. In my first plot, I want to plot X against Y0 with the data source specified. In the second plot, I just give X with Y1. And the thing to note here is that the data source is the same. So the minute you give the same data source to two graphs, those two are linked in a way. And the X values are also linked here. So this allows you to perform linked brushing. And then I specify a plot with the left and the right graphs. And ta-da, you have linked brushing implemented. So for more information on the various interactions, you can check this out. There is zoom, there is lasso select, there is also hover, clicking. A lot of functionality is provided inbuilt with Bokeh. So these are just some of the interactions that I thought were interesting and would give you an idea of the main concepts behind interaction. So I've covered only a subset of the interactions, and hopefully this will give you an idea or a window into the different interactivity that Bokeh can provide to you. So I'm going to try last time to get the demo to work, and then we can look at the last topic. Oh yes, so the demo works this time. So this is just one of the sample demos, and this is the OMDB movie dataset. And here I have a number of sliders. I have a select widget there, and these are input boxes where I can give various names. I have a number of selects. So as I select any of these values, the graph changes. And I can specify this, zooms in. I can specify the number of Oscars, take everything. I can provide x-axis. I can select the y-axis. There's so many functions that can be added with just simple widgets and reflecting that on the graph. So this one does not have a toolbar, but there are a number of widgets that allow you to select a subset of the data. So this is one of the demos that I like. I think there is also a slider demo that's quite interesting. That's what it's called. Yes. So this is just a sine wave, and I can select the phase, can select the amplitude, can pick the offset, can pick the frequency, and as you can see, everything changes accordingly. You can also pick a subset of the data, and you can zoom into the data. So this is just inbuilt, really simple widgets that Bokeh supports for you. So there are a number of demos that you can check out on demo.bokeh.org. I think I've also put the link here. So go ahead, try out the demos, try to create them with open data. There's a lot of linking that you can try out, a lot of interactions. And again, it's very simple. So now coming to the last section, which is exporting visualizations. Bokeh, so far we have looked at inline interactions or inline visualization inside Jupyter Notebooks. Bokeh also allows you to generate HTML output, integrated into templates, integrated into apps, servers, also allows you to export static images. So here you can look at all the various ways to embed it. I will look at saving your output to an HTML file and also just brush upon what you can do to save it to images. So in the beginning, if you remember, we spoke about output notebook and output file. Output file allows you to specify a file to which you want to write the output. So here, if you see, I have a separate file generated called plot.html, and it's being saved in the same folder. And it opens in a new tab. So let's see how we did each of those. So far, the code is exactly the same. What is different is I have output file. So output file is a parameter that once set, it will output anything after this to an HTML file with the name plot.html. And when I say show off the plot name, it will open a new browser tab and display it there. Similarly, when I say save of the plot name, it will do the same thing, but it will not open a new browser tab for you. So you can do this for any kind of visualization. All you have to do is add these two lines. So now I wrap up with the last exercise. That is, try saving your output to an HTML file, but this time try it with save so that it's not open in a new browser tab. So I'm going to give maybe 3 minutes for this.
Yeah, 3 minutes.
Yeah, and then we quickly wind up. while you're trying out the exercises, Bokeh also allows to save as a static image, and it supports PNG and SVG formats. So because I think this workshop is long enough already and we're running short of time, I've just added a link of how to export it into a static image. So this is again quite simple. All you have to do is specify one parameter in your figure, and then it will export it to whatever format you want. So that's about it. And yeah, I mainly wanted to cover the interactions and the basic concepts of Bokeh. Hopefully, I've been able to portray those. And there are also a list of tutorials where you can go ahead and look at further details, further questions, explore each of these concepts more in detail. I have not covered Bokeh apps or servers or dashboards, but again, those are just simple functionalities on top of these. They're effectively just layers on top of these. So if you have these concepts set, you're good to go with Bokeh. So good luck, try out a lot of visualizations, pick an open source data set, pick a sample data set, try to visualize it, make a story out of it, because I think the best way to express data is through a story in the form of visualization. So good luck exploring Bokeh. And now we can move on to the Q&A session. So I would like to invite Pavitra and Brian to join me for that.
Yeah, great. And also, Brian, could you unmute yourself and introduce yourself briefly for the audience?
Hi, can you hear me?
Of course.
Okay, great. We never know these days. So my name is Brian Vandeven, and I am one of the core team members for the Bokeh project. I've really been working on it since it was created in around 2012. At the time, I was working at Anaconda, which is a company that helps promote Python for data science and science and creates the Anaconda distribution. Well, at the time, it was Continuum Analytics. And currently I work at NVIDIA, and really grateful to have the opportunity to continue to work on Bokeh somewhat as part of the work there on Rapids. But I'm also grateful to have the opportunity to be here and answer any questions or have discussions around Bokeh. In these trying times, at least it's good that we can all bring people together from all over the world and have events like this. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, also want to point out that although the basic about auditorium is in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, Pavitra joined us from India and Brian joined us from United States. So it's really international meeting right now. Okay, before starting our Q&A, I just want to briefly tell about the rules. It's easy as that. You have three panelists, Bhoomika, Brian, and Pavitra. In case of any questions, you can raise the hands, or if there's a question for one particular person, mention this person name in the question. And if it's the question to everybody, okay, just post it as it is. So let's start. And I have a very specific question for you, actually, I think, Brian. So how the idea was born to create Bokeh?
Yeah, sure. So, Bokeh was really, it wasn't just me for sure. But going back a little bit, so I've always been interested in data visualization. I used to work with a tool called VTK, which is the visualization toolkit. It's a tool for 3D data viz, and it must be 20-some years old at this point. It's a very mature, old piece of software. And then a little bit later on, I worked at a company called InThought, and I worked with Peter Wang, who's the current CEO of Anaconda, and he had developed a library called Chaco for interactive data visualization in like rich client settings. And it was kind of contemporaneous with the beginning of Matplotlib. And they were sort of, I don't want to say competing, but Matplotlib sort of definitely decisively won that battle. But a few years later, when Continuum/Anaconda was getting off the ground, we wanted to revisit some of those ideas that Chaco had about interactivity. That was really the focus of Chaco, was this interactive data visualization. But we wanted to revisit those ideas in a browser, because it was 2012 and it was very clear that the future of things was going to be, publishing and sharing results in notebooks in the browser. And so really the main impetus for creating Bokeh was to, have these ideas for interactive data visualization in sort of web apps from Python, and make it very easy to make those things from Python. And then incidentally, we also wanted to make sure we could handle things like streaming data cases and also some of the large data cases. And some of the work for large data sets has moved into like other projects like Data Shader, but they're still closely related to Bokeh. So, but that's the main idea, is this interactivity in the browser from Python with minimal JavaScript / web work on the user's part.
Cool, great, awesome. I also have, until the people thinking what's the best question to ask, I have a question for Pavitra. Actually, how you joined the Bokeh development team?
This is a very interesting story. So last year, Brian put out a tweet saying he would be mentoring somebody from an underrepresented, anyone underrepresented in tech. I think another person, a Pandas developer, Mark, right? He also put out a tweet. So I contacted Brian through that tweet, and that's how the journey started. Yeah, it's been a fun journey.
But was it scary to create the first pull request?
Yes, it took me a while. I was just in the background for, I don't know, for months together. And I think I started working on some plots in September, but it took me 4 to 5 months. This year, like in January or something, I actually made a proper pull request.
Great. But any piece of advice to our workshop attendants who wants to start to commit to open source, and especially for Bokeh, but afraid of it?
I think, okay, so I can just talk from my perspective. So my first reaction was that I was intimidated by the code base, right? I was just scared looking at the developer documentation and, okay, I have to do so many things, and what if I can't do it? But when I actually made the first pull request, it took me like half an hour. And I was so mad at myself because I could have done it so much earlier. So the first advice just would be to go for it, like just jump into the deep side and see what happens.
Cool. Okay.
I have one question. So
Yeah.
While developing Bokeh, or what are the most common kind of issues that you see, or the most common complaints that you see while developing Bokeh?
I guess I can chime in because it actually sort of dovetails. One thing I wanted to mention is that there's a lot of ways to contribute to different open source projects, and I just want to be completely clear that a lot, not all of them involve code. In fact, a project that gets mature really has a lot of different needs, and we have needs for graphic designers, for web designers, for people to help with outreach, for people to help with fundraising, for people to help with improving our documentation, which is a lot of work. As well as code. And so there's lots and lots of ways to plug in. This is a really great time to plug into Bokeh just because there's a really big surface area. In terms of issues that we have with Bokeh and areas of improvement for technical things, I think right now, one of the things that sort of shows about Bokeh is it was created for people not to have to write a lot of JavaScript, but if we're being honest, it was actually created by a bunch of Python developers in 2012 who didn't really know a lot of JavaScript either. And I think that shows through in certain ways. And there's a lot of people who now want to interface Bokeh with like a lot of popular web frameworks, React or Vue or all these things. And we just maybe haven't done the work because we haven't found the time to set aside to really explain some of those use cases really well. And so having like a really great front-end developer come and help improve the story about how to integrate Bokeh into these other web frameworks on the JavaScript side would be really, really great, because that's definitely a thing that's come up, more often, especially recently.
I have a question as well. What is in the future of Bokeh? Like, what is on the short-term roadmap? What is coming up? And after that, I want to say maybe to everybody that it's not want to ask a question, but it's not really asking a question. You can also type it privately to me or Ilona, and we can ask it for you if you're scared to ask.
Sure. Okay. Well, I can comment on that too. So a lot of exciting stuff coming up. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to improve the WebGL support in Bokeh. So there's been sort of some partial WebGL support for a long time and really want to sort of redo that. Really have a focus and an emphasis on performance and memory, handling, sort of on the very technical side. What I mentioned about being able to integrate with or sort of building up Bokeh.js as a first-class JavaScript library is actually, I think, a really important goal. I'd love to get actual JavaScript developers interested in contributing to Bokeh, because again, I don't think I'm a very good JavaScript front-end developer. I think I could use a lot of help. And I think it would be great to get the input from folks who are working more as front-end JavaScript developers about what they would need and like from Bokeh. So I'd like to try to do some outreach to get that, more people interested in that. But in terms of other work, there's always work ongoing to improve the infrastructure of Bokeh. The technical work is, just never ending, I guess. There's an infinite list of things to do. One of the things that I'm really excited about and that Pavitra really helped with is that we just started the Google season of docs. And so we brought on someone to do work on our documentation. We had a meeting with them today to kick things off. They have a lot of amazing ideas about how to help reorganize our documentation to make it easier to digest and understand. That's definitely an area that has needed attention for quite some time, and so I'm super excited about that. So hopefully that'll be something that's coming up in the next couple of months, even to spin up some really nice dramatic improvements to documentation around accessibility and around the data information architecture of the docs. And so I'm excited about that. Sorry, I'm a little scattered. There is a roadmap sort of document. If you go to bokeh.org and down the footer, there's a roadmap, and you can see some of the things we're interested in looking into in the near future. And there's just a variety of things. We also have I should mention, we also have a proposal out to CZI for the essential open source software for science. And again, Pavitra was an enormous help here. I could not have done this alone. And so we proposed there to do a lot of work around adding math text support. So LaTeX equation editors, a lot of scientists want this kind of math text. And so that is a big feature. Fingers crossed, we'll be able to get that CZI money. And then we have someone we are looking to hire to implement all of that math text work and some SVG work as well, really to cater to some of those scientific needs.
Okay, cool. I also, just a little bit outside of it. Oh, thanks for sharing roadmap with us, Pavitra. Thanks a lot. I'm also curious for Bhoomika, when was the first time you actually started using Bokeh and why?
So, I think I started about 2 months ago for one of my data visualization courses where we had to implement a project. So then I looked at the basic interactivity and just basic plots. I think till where I am right now. So that's how much I explored. I think it took me about 2 weeks back then to just understand the concepts. And I think a lot of the tutorials are just all over the place. And then I chanced upon the Bokeh official documentation and tutorial, which really helped me a lot. So since then, I've been using it wherever possible, and I really like using it as well. So I think it's a good starting point for anyone who wants to try out data visualization.
Okay, cool. And the question to Pavitra, what's your favorite part of Bokeh? What do you like more or the best?
Okay, so it's a controversial statement, but I actually like the community around Bokeh. I mean, using the tool, it's amazing. Like all of us know that, but the developers and Brian especially has been just so nice and so helpful. Like all the core members, like the people we've interacted with, they're just so nice and awesome. They just want me to stay here all the time. So that is the best part about Bokeh. It's the people behind it.
Okay, so now if somebody asks me what should I pick, Bokeh, Streamlit, or Dash, I will say Bokeh.
Well, maybe, Brian, or you can argue why you should pick Bokeh above other tools.
Sure. So, I mean, it's interesting. There's a lot of, so the Python data visualization space is very crowded. If you compare it to something like R, where everyone's really using a ggplot and is very happy with that. And I think the reason for that is that Python is maybe used in a bit more broader context. So R is very geared towards statistical computing, and so ggplot has a very sort of solid theoretical foundation to build visualizations on from that. But people use Python for data science and statistics, but also sort of science where there's a lot of dense measurements made, and there's just a lot of different stuff that has nothing to do with science at all. So there's a lot of different competing use cases, and so a lot of the tools overlap quite a bit, I would say. So I mean, our most direct sort of comparisons are usually to things like Plotly. Streamlit is sort of at a higher level. It's kind of like Panel and Streamlit can use Plotly or Bokeh or Matplotlib, and so they're sort of at a higher level. If you want very high level sort of dashboarding stuff, you can sort of make the use of the best thing of everything. But if you're comparing to like Plotly, I mean, the things that I like to say, they're both really good tools, and obviously people should use whatever works for them. Specifically for Bokeh, some of the things that we do really well is our Bokeh server has a nice protocol for very efficiently transferring a lot of data. So if you are doing something more scientific and you have like dense arrays of data like images that you need to translate, transfer and update, you want to scrub a slider and have a sort of an image update very rapidly, we're very good at that use case. Plotly, on the other hand, is an actual company of 30 or 40 or however many people, and I think they've been able to put a little bit more polish on some of the dashboarding use cases. And this is an area where we'd love to get help from folks who have opinions about making really great looking front end stuff, and also can help out with implementing that stuff. We'd love to try to catch up with that, but it just depends. There's a lot of overlap, but then there's a few use cases here and there, and I think that some of the the larger data scientific stuff is the niche where Bokeh is really good, and then other areas, I don't want to say it's a toss-up. I think you should use Bokeh, but but there's a lot more similarity in sort of just if you just need a scatter plot, they both can make a scatter plot, right? So it's really up to what API suits your preference or style more, and whether or not any of those niche cases apply.
Okay, great. There is a question for Brian and Pavitra. It's a long one, so hold on. Have you thought about integration of interactive plots in scientific papers? Nowadays, many of the articles, even if they got published in PDF, mostly checked online. So why not provide plots that are naturally interactive and zoomable? Could you think about joining with a publisher to test this? Thank you, Claudia, for question.
I'll just chime in because I know this has already been done. The first Bokeh plot in a paper that I'm aware of happened 4 or 5 years ago, I think. This is, I would say this is a matter that's really up to people who want to publish these plots. I'd love to find ways to help them. And if people have connections to publishers where we can facilitate this, that'd also be a great way to help out and to join the community. I just don't have those I don't have those connections. I don't know any publishers. If someone can put the Bokeh team in contact with some folks, we'd love to have discussions. Certainly, if there's things we can do to help facilitate integrating or embedding Bokeh plots, in journal sites or sidecar sites for journals, yeah, I think that'd be a great idea.
Oh, it sounds really good. And any tips or any pieces of advice about the best practices in using Bokeh, best practices while saving figures, while saving particular types of outputs? Anyone?
That's a really broad question. It really depends. Some people need SVG output for journal articles, for instance, and some people need PNGs, or either for the same reason or for just having a static image. Some people need to embed into a Flask or a Django or a Cherry Pie web application. Some people need a real Bokeh server application because they want to have callbacks that can trigger real Python code executing. It's just a really big project with really broad applications. So it really comes down to the details, I would say, and that's an area where I know this kind of thing I would send people to the discourse. So we have a discourse at discourse.bokeh.org. You try to answer questions there. It's an all-volunteer basis, and people get to it when they can. But we try to be very responsive. But that's where you can describe something in detail, and we can actually get into those details and say, well, in this situation, the best practice, would be this or that. But it really does come down, I think, to what you're actually trying to accomplish and what are the constraints that are you're seeing for your project.
Great, and I just shared the link to this discourse, bokeh.org. So if you have any question, go there, ask it, and people swarm together to help you answer it more detailed, right? Okay.
If I may add on to this, like I mentioned, it's always good to have to have good documentation, or rather just simple things like naming your axis, naming your plots, because now you might be doing one plot, 10 days later it's 10 plots. And then when you look at that 1 month later, you're just completely lost. So it's always good to be neat, to have good documentation about what you're doing, just basic programming things. So keep that in mind. And also, again, it depends on the use case a lot, like Brian mentioned already.
That's a great example of thinking about things from like a different perspective. I was coming at it from a very technical, oh, how do we save things out? And what are the different ways to save? But this is actually a really good point about, yeah, it's very good to label, like labeling axis isn't something that we enforce in Bokeh. We let people do it. It's interesting. People have now built tools on top of Bokeh. And there's one in particular called Chartify that I think Spotify put together. And that's a very opinionated tool for data visualization. And they, for instance, mandate, you can't create a plot in Chartify without labeling your axes or without providing a title and things like that. And so, yeah, those are very good suggestions. Again, coming from just a completely different point of view than I had imagined the question. It's great.
Yeah, you mentioned also that, there is a lot of things that the people can be helpful to Bokeh. But for now, what's the, let's say, top 3 priority that you need help with?
Let's see. I think I'm going to come back to that thing about really wanting to be able to integrate Bokeh into really popular JavaScript frameworks. Like, this is something people really want to do. And I think that we can do that now. There might be a few places where we could use some development help, but a lot of it's just proving things out and maybe making some demonstrations and some examples and adding to the documentation people could follow. But again, if people want to use Bokeh plots inside React or inside Vue, and I don't know how to do that really, because I'm not an expert on those things. And but I'd love to demonstrate those things for other people to know how they can do them. There's also lately been some questions about deploying Bokeh server apps in different situations. And this is another area where sort of crowdsourcing can really help, because there's a lot of different cloud providers. People want to deploy Bokeh apps on Heroku and DigitalOcean and AWS and Azure. And this is a case where it'd be great if someone could figure out how to do one, and then we can write up some documentation about how to do that or some examples, and then someone else can do the next one, and we can sort of all crowdsource it together. And so demonstrating those kind of usage, I think, would be really, really valuable to a lot of Bokeh users. And then I'm not sure what the third thing would be. We have a lot. There's just a lot of things. What?
Folks can help with testing.
Oh yeah. Actually, that's a great thing to mention. So we just did our release again. We sort of resurrected something we hadn't done in a while, which is actually having sort of a manual test matrix where we have all the different platforms and all the different sections, and we just fill it in, red, green, or yellow before the release. And we used to do that a lot. Back when Bokeh was more inside of Anaconda, and now it's sort of its own open source, independent project, and we hadn't done it in a while, but we brought that back, and we'd love to get people who want to help with release testing. I mean, just to make sure that we get the best releases that we can, and that's for sure an area where anyone could help out. Just filling in a row in a spreadsheet, or even a particular cell for, this stuff works on this browser with this release candidate, and we can check it off and know that that'll be good for the release. So that kind of testing help is great. Or our CI and automation. Infrastructure is another area where Bokeh actually has a fair amount of infrastructure, both CI automation as well as things on AWS that we have to run. So anyone who wants to help out with infrastructure is great. We could actually use data science help. We have a lot of data from, for instance, CDN logs and other things, and we'd love to dive into some of that. We scrub our data of IP addresses down to an anonymized thing just so we can see refers, but we'd love to have someone maybe analyze that. And so if someone has data science and wants to dig into that data set, we could look into that as well. So like I said, there's lots of ways to help out and lots of priorities. It's hard. It's both hard to narrow it down to 2 and also hard to stop, or hard to only think of 2.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was pretty intensive, but really interesting one. And also the question is like, are there any other packages on top of? Oh, I see that already Pavitra answering it besides Certify. Okay, so if it's already answered, then we can skip this part. And I also want to get back to Pavitra for a second. So, okay, you mentioned that Brian helped a lot, and the book has the best community of developers. But I'm still really curious to know on which projects you are working right now. So Brian mentioned it briefly, but can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes, so I was actually wanted to get back to that. So as Brian said, there's more to open source than just code. There's documentation, outreach, fundraising, a lot of more stuff. So I help out a lot with the other organizational things. I help set up meeting notes and sprints, some workshops and things like that. And just any work I can pick up and do. I try to look into some code and documentation here and there. But yeah, I just help out where I can, which all of us can do. And coming back to what I wanted to say, we have a lot of outreach programs. That's also a way folks can get involved in open source. Season of Docs, as Brian mentioned, we have Google Summer of Code, Outreachy, and Hacktoberfest is coming up. So if folks want to start getting involved in open source, that is a very good opportunity where you have a lot of good first bugs that people pick out for Hacktoberfest. So that's a good place to start as well.
Oh, are there any links that you can share with us about this?
Yes, I shall do that. Just give me 2 minutes. I'll share all the links together.
Okay, it sounds really fascinating. So let's say we are coming to almost to the end. We have still 2 minutes. So what I want to hear from each of you, just a piece of advice for our Python developers.
Oh, good. It's fun. I don't know. My brain does not like to offer things like that. I don't know. There's a lot of good projects. I mean, I think it's good just to try to, take the first step and just get involved in any way, because anyone who's like sort of on a core team for an open source project is going to love to get any kind of help or interest. Now, attention is limited like that. There's been a lot of discussion on Twitter lately about how the thing that's in the limited resource is like core developers' attention. And that's absolutely true. And definitely people can get overwhelmed with, for instance, like support requests. But anytime anyone wants to help out with the project itself, I mean, I know that I'm glad to carve out some time and try to find some time to answer questions, to help mentor, to help integrate someone into our community of developers, in meetings. And so just take the first step and get involved. Try to find something that's interesting to you personally, because that certainly helps with motivation. I think is to be personally invested in something. It's hard to give like Python technical advice, because honestly, what I found over the years is that the software eventually really becomes a people problem, not a problem, but I mean that's where all the work is, right? I mean, the code is certainly a big part of things, but ultimately you have to navigate relationships with other people who are working on the project, writing code, or navigating with if you're dealing with sprints. And Pavitra, by the way, she's really way too modest. Like, I mean, she has helped us participate in sprints that by helping to organize that. We wouldn't have been in the sprints, and she helped run the sprints while we were there and get us into those sprints. And we're going to be doing more later this year, but especially the CZI proposal, which would be a really big deal for the project. We applied once in round 1 and didn't get it, and we applied again in round 3, and our proposal is light years better this time around, and it's really due to Pavitra staying on top of everything and helping make that proposal better, because again, that's a really important part of the work, and it just didn't get done very well the first time around, and now with her help, it's been much better. And I'm actually excited. I'm cautiously hopeful that we might actually get that CCI grant this year. So.
Awesome.
But yeah.
Thanks. Pavitra, what about you?
Well, I think I forgot the question, but I think it was something around advice with Python, right?
Yeah.
So I just have more of a general advice with when learning anything. One thing I see folks do is get stuck up in tutorials. I mean, tutorial after tutorial after tutorial, which only get you so far. So my advice is just to start building projects and start getting some real world experience in a way, which is, I mean, the learning there is much different and sort of a lot deeper.
Awesome. Thank you.
I also put on the links in the chat.
Yeah, we saw it. And Bhoomika, your piece of advice.
My advice is sort of in line with Pavitra's, where a piece of code can look very complicated if you just look at it. But once you start typing it out and try it yourself, it's quite simple. So don't get caught up in the syntax, just give it a shot, try out programming. Just looking at code will not get you anywhere. So you have to jump in, get some hands-on, try it out with some real data, and then it's not so bad. Yeah, go ahead and give it a shot.
Great.